Once upon a time, in a faraway land,
What are fairy stories?
The strange and wondrous place where nothing is as it seems.
Magic mirror on the wall. Who is the fairest?
Fairy is a perilous land.
Before she found herself falling down what seemed to be a very deep
It
well.
is the place you visit
A world
in your
of
dreams.
myth and magic.
when the clock began to
The
chime
evening
midnight,
star sailed down through the
A
sky.
mysterious voice began calling to the sad
She
princess.
pricked her finger with her needle. 3 drops of blood fell on the
In a
small
trance,
white
she
finger.
followed the haunting
And peered
sound
into the
of the
hollow
winding
tree.
stairway to the top of the
You
tower.
can read along with me in your book.
she waved her wand and said the magic words.
Let's begin now.
Well met, witches, and welcome to Storybook Sacred Lore of Witchcraft. We have a special guest in our circle today, Sara Mastros. Sara has been called the single most important living teacher in witchcraft today, recognized by her peers as a brilliant and original thinker, an engaging and inspiring teacher, a compelling and clever writer, and a generally decent human being. Sara spends a lot of time dreaming, thinking, enchanting, writing, and teaching about witchcraft, magic, and myth. She especially interested in the magical communication, translation, and cryptography, but her true passion is raising up an army of inspired, educated, and empowered witches prepared to weave weird new ways of being in a world that desperately needs us rise up. That is a wonderful introduction. What else would you like listeners to know about you as a quick intro, Sara?
I mean, I gotta say that was a pretty great intro. It's probably
That was
gonna be
pretty
all
encompassing,
downhill from
yeah.
there. Like I can't get cooler than that. I don't really know what else to add except to really highlight that, like, at least right now, I really feel strongly called to teach. So, like, my primarily, like, capital W work in the world right now really is like teaching and raising up a generation of witches for, like, I think we all know that times are getting weirder and we're gonna have to get weird. Like, us weirdos are gonna have to rise to that challenge.
You have an exciting course that I believe is coming up or just begun, which was one of the inspirations for me to ask you to be on this discussion. Would you like to describe your main course right now?
Sure. So right now I'm teaching 2 courses. I have Introduction to Witchcraft, 13 Lessons in Practical Magic, which is, pretty much what the name says. I really try and focus on building skills in what I think of as sort of like a paradigm agnostic way. So I think those of us who have been, like, working magic for a long time, I think we all understand that even if somebody came up in a very different tradition, like, once you kind of, like, work out some vocab, like, a lot of it is sort of similar, right? And we can all talk to each other. So I'm trying in that course really to build up basic skills to, like, prepare people to kind of launch from there in almost any direction they want magically. But it's really primarily focused on skill building. And even though, like, I design it for, like, absolute beginners, like, you don't need to know anything to start in that class. Objectively, like, I keep in mind the fact that most of the people in the class are actually not beginners, and many people are coming into it with, like, 20 years of experience. But, I think it's always valuable to, like, see the way somebody else does something, especially, the first time I ever took, like, an official, like, course, because when I was coming up in witchcraft, that didn't really exist, right? Like, in the 80s and 90s, there weren't, at least where I lived, like, that was not an option, right? So by the time I took one, I'd been practicing for a long time, but I really felt like I was just, like, stuck in my practice, and I really just needed, like, a sort of push to do some new things. And so I took Jason Miller's strategic sorcery course. And that's a lot of, I think of it similarly, right? Like, that, like, if you're feeling kind of stuck and you just want to, like, sort of see some new stuff to get you inspired, the intro course is good for that. And then I also have a course that matches up with my new book, which is on the Solomonic Pentacles.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And how would you describe your craft or religious practice? Like, what would you say your path is?
I feel like that's sort of a complicated question. I do a lot of different things. Religiously, I'm Jewish, which is primarily, like, I think a lot of people, especially people who came up Christian, there's a tendency to think about Judaism as if it's like Christianity light, but it's really not at all. Like, it's while Judaism has a religion, Judaism isn't a religion the same way like the Pueblo Nation has a religion, but you don't have to practice that religion to be Pueblo. Like, Judaism is primarily a tribal affinity. And so I think of it that way. But I do, have a strong relationship with the God of my Jewish ancestors. But also, my mom's family's Jewish and my dad's family's Greek. So then I also have a really strong relationship with like the ancient Greek gods of my father's people. When I was really young and I first got into Wicca, I was told like, oh, you should like stick to your ancestral paganisms. And I don't necessarily think that's true for anybody, but I'm half Greek and half Jewish. So that left me like, that's a really rich category that I like never really felt the need. Like, I got a lot of gods and like a lot of magic books that are very well preserved, right? Relative to like, I think people from Western Europe, like there's maybe like just less material to go on. Like, I'm not going to run out of Jewish and Greek texts at any point. So I mostly focus on that. And I'm really interested particularly in sort of the, like the cross-cultural magic of the Eastern Mediterranean, right?
Sure.
So Egypt and Greece and Rome and the Holy Land and like that whole area, there's like a complicated multicultural sorcery growing up in that area, starting in late antiquity and continuing through the today. And I would say like that's sort of where my focus is. And for me, this is really important, like, I am not a reconstructionist, right? Like, I'm not interested in practicing ancient paganism. I practice 21st century paganism here in the 21st century in the city of Pittsburgh where I live, right? And that's where my practice is rooted, is like in the time I live, in the world I live in.
You answered a couple of the questions that were coming up in my head, and then even a couple of the thoughts I was having to those answers. And we have Annabelle, AV. Would you like to give an introduction to everybody?
Hello. This is AV from AV Witch Journal. I want to say thank you again for welcoming me here in this space. I'm very upfront all the time that I'm a beginner / intermediate practitioner, I will say. Well, I will say more beginner than anything else. And I do enjoy the opportunity to be here because every single time that I join this podcast, I get to talk with people that has so many years of experience in their practice. And I proudly say I like to steal a lot of information. Not steal, but I like to learn from everyone. So that on that side.
Information wants to be free.
So thank you for welcoming me here.
Well, there's a lot of things that I'm like dying to talk to you about, but officially we are here to talk about the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. I'm going to take a quick interlude to say, like, the story of Solomon, is about as much as I know, is that the immemorial Solomon possessed knowledge inspired by the wise teachings of an angel, to which he appeared so submissive and obedient that in addition to the gift of wisdom, which he demanded, he obtained with profusion all other virtues which happened in order that knowledge of worthy eternal preservation might not be buried with his body.
Is that from the introduction to the Mathers edition of the Key of Solomon?
Yes, to the Mathers Key of Solomon. But how would you describe for us the tale of the King of Solomon?
Well, so let me talk a little bit about, like, before I sort of tell the story, let me talk a little bit about, like, where we know this story from.
Okay.
Right? So Solomon is a really complicated mythological character whose mythology like spans a lot of different cultures and, like more than 2,500 years, right? So the oldest stories about Solomon that we still have access to today are in the Book of Kings in Torah, right? Where it sort of outlines like his reign. I think it's important to understand that, like, in the context in which they were written and for the people for which those books have been appropriated in a lot of like weird, gross ways. But in the context they were written for the people for whom they are written, like they're not intended to be a history textbook. They're intended to be a mythic history of our people, right? And to teach certain lessons, right? And so, spoiler, I'm going to tell the story of Solomon, but I really want to sort of skip to the end. The moral of the story of Solomon, as I understand it, right, of this like really rich, complex hagiography, there are a lot of morals you can pull out, but the one I'm going to focus on is this, right? That Solomon is the, like, legendarily the wisest man who ever lived. And at the times in his life when he didn't have a partner, when there was no one else in his life who was as powerful as him, no one who was empowered to call him on his bullshit, he became corrupt. Every time he lacked someone to call him on his bullshit, he becomes corrupt. And that happens multiple times over his story, right?
Is this like the first archetypal story of absolute power corrupting absolutely?
Oh, I mean, I think as soon as humans are telling stories, that's an important human story, but it's definitely a really old story, right? So the Book of King, I should have looked up these exact dates. I'm not great. You guys are gonna notice as I tell this story that I like don't have a great head for like specific dates. It's all in the book if you look it up. So the Book of Kings, right, is our oldest story, and it sort of recounts like kind of the bare bones of Solomon's hagiography, right? Which is that Solomon is the son of King David by Queen Bathsheba, right? So I'm going to try hard to distinguish. I'm going to tell a story that is embroidered from multiple historical sources, but also occasionally I'm going to throw in just like my own, like, oh, a ghost told me this part. And I will try and keep those distinct, right? But if you want like a very clean footnoted version of this, you could read my book, right? Like I'm going to tell a story. So David is the king of Israel, right? And for most of David is famed as an exorcist and a musician. He like is famously like just strongly favored by God. Like all the signs are that like the hand of the supernatural has put this boy who was not born to the royal line, right, on the throne of Israel. But David's entire reign, he is at war with basically all of his neighbors, right? And so like his generals are really important people in his court. So one of them is named Uriah. Uriah is a close friend of David's. Uriah has this hot young wife named Bathsheba. So side note, I'm going to tell a story where this is going to be relevant later. Her name means daughter of seven, which can mean like daughter of the Sabbath. It can mean daughter of the number seven. It can mean like daughter of the stars, like the seven stars, by which we mean the seven. Actually not the Pleiades, the seven classical planets. Yeah, wow. Right. But like, no, maybe the Pleiades. But in this particular case, I'm pretty sure the planets.
The planets. Yeah, of course. Yes.
It's spelled a little differently than like the Queen of Sheba. Bathsheba could mean daughter of Sheba, but I will say they are spelled slightly differently, but they share the same root word, right? Like the country Sheba, which I'm going to talk about later. I just like put that in the back of your head, right? So Uriah the general is married to Bathsheba. She's really hot. Uriah's off at war. David and Bathsheba start having an affair, and Bathsheba gets pregnant while her husband is away at war. So David, and I want to stress this is his BFF, whose wife he has been stooping, right? Which is Yiddish for fucking. Right? He sends Uriah on a suicide mission so that he can marry his wife, which like, how deeply fucked up is that? But that's what happens, right? David and Bathsheba marry. Nathan the prophet, who is like David's advisor, basically, like David's chief advisor at this point, has been since like for a long time, right? He talks to David and he's like, yo, that is so fucked up. I can't believe you did that. God is going to punish you. And he does. That baby dies, right? And like, blah, blah, blah. David gets his shit together and like gets right with the Lord. Bathsheba has another son whom they name Solomon. So Solomon's name means peacemaker, right? You can hear it's related, like his Hebrew name is Shlomo, which is more like easier to hear that is related to shalom or the Arabic salam, right? A whole category of words that are all actually, the root word is evening or west or the evening star, right? So you get to peace by like, the sun sets in the west and then it's evening and you stop working and rest. And things are peaceful. Like that's the relationship between all these words. So you can also hear it in like Jerusalem. Yerushalim is the house of peace or the house of salam. I'm going to hit this a couple times in this story. And I'm not going to accuse you of anything, but I've said this in a couple of interviews and it has been cut. So I'm going to say this many times so I cannot be misunderstood. Solomon makes peace with his neighbors. He is the great peacemaker. Israel flourishes under his reign because Israel makes peace with her neighbors, and Israel is only strong and only righteous when we are at peace. And I would like to call for a ceasefire right the fuck now. That's been cut from several interviews, so I'm just going to say it over and over. Not that I'm accusing you of cutting it, but several people have cut it. And I'm tired of it being cut. But again, I don't think you guys would do that, right? So, right, Solomon is born. He is named Peace, or I'm going to say Peacemaker, right? And that is for a lot of reasons. Some people say it's because David has made his peace with the Lord, but I think legendarily he is named Peace because unlike his father David, who is famed as a warrior king, right? Solomon is a diplomat king, a peacemaker king. So Solomon comes to the throne quite young. David is quite old when Solomon is born. And Solomon is not the like natural heir. Like he has several older brothers. There's a bit of a war of conquest, but really the Queen Bathsheba and Nathan the prophet conspire to put Solomon on the throne. Since he was a very young child, Solomon has had like the mark of God on him. He's a prodigy. He like speaks not just the languages of all his neighbors, but he speaks the language of the beasts and the birds and the spirits. He speaks to the plants. I've noticed that Christian translations will say he speaks about the plants, but it definitely says he speaks with the plants, right? And like all these with the stars, with the spirits, all these things that we understand as like foundational acts of magic, right? So Solomon comes to the throne, right? And for the first part of his reign, he marries Pharaoh's daughter. He marries a lot of his neighbors' daughters to make peace. And he builds a lot of infrastructure, including the Holy Temple, but a lot of other like infrastructure, hospitals and schools and roads and a new aqueduct system. Like he builds a lot of sophisticated infrastructure in Jerusalem and in Israel broadly. Again, I want to highlight that like Israel becomes powerful, becomes important, becomes prosperous and exciting because he is making peace and as a result of that peace. Right. But eventually his mother and Nathan the prophet both die. And he like doesn't have like, just like Nathan did for his father David, Nathan is calling Solomon on his shit. Right. But after a while, Nathan dies and and his mother is dead. There's nobody left. Like he's just the king and nobody like feels safe just telling him to his face that he's full of crap. So, so at this point in the Torah narrative, right, the Queen of Sheba, all Torah tells us about her is that she is the wisest woman in the world, just like Solomon is the wisest man in the world, that she rules a very, very rich and prosperous kingdom far to the south. Some people speculate about where Sheba is. I actually don't think Sheba is even intended to be like a specific place. I think of Sheba as like sort of Bronze Age Wakanda. I guess it's the Iron Age by now, like Iron Age Wakanda. You know what I mean? It's like this legendary place where they have like great wisdom and great power and fabulous wealth unheard of anywhere else in the world. So she comes looking. Now, I'm going to start to insert my own everything I've said before, very straightforward telling, right? So now a little piece. I believe, with no justification whatsoever, except for my 30 years of study and my deep spiritual connection to these people and my deep versing in all these classical texts, but the Queen of Sheba tells me, right, that Bathsheba, right, is not a proper name, it's a title, that it means daughter of Sheba, right, and that Bathsheba is like a sort of witch spy who was sent by the previous Queen of Sheba, right, like not the Queen of Sheba in our Solomon story, but her predecessor, right, that Bathsheba was specifically sent. Like they heard about this exorcist, this young magical exorcist king who like had the favor of the gods in Israel, and Sheba, like she was specifically sent to entangle their royal lines, right? Note, it's going to be relevant in this story. I do not understand the queenhood of Sheba to be hereditary, right? So like when I say Bathsheba is a daughter of the Queen of Sheba, I don't mean that in like a genetic sense. I mean, she's like a, high priestess, right? So the Queen of Sheba, right, Malika Sheva, right, it can mean Queen of Sheba, but it can also mean Queen of the Stars. And there is a related title in Egyptian priestcraft that would indicate basically like a master astrologer, right? So I understand the Queen of Sheba in like my version of this story, like in addition to being the queen, she's also like the high priestess of this star cult, right? That like they have a star religion, a planetary religion, which is actually the religion you would expect them to have historically, right? At that time and place, right? Like that's the religion of like most of Israel's neighbors at this point, particularly her southern neighbors, right? So she comes, right? So like now she's heard about like this, so like, you know, Bathsheba has written and kept her abreast, and now Bathsheba is dead, and she's coming to see for herself this wise king, that like young king that all the spirits are talking about. So she comes, now we're back to the Torah narrative, right? With like vast riches and like a giant assembly of people. She and Solomon like test each other with riddles, basically, to establish that they are both super wise. They teach each other. Torah does not explicitly say they are lovers, but that is certainly the normative way to understand that story. There's a part in the Song of Songs, sometimes called the Song of Solomon, because it begins, this is the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, right? It's weird. So the Song of Songs is traditionally attributed to Solomon as author, though, I mean, I don't think any reasonable person understands that literally, right? But I mean, I too take dictation from dead people, so that doesn't seem as crazy, you know, like, but he's traditionally the author, but also he is sometimes understood as a character in that. So there's like the king is getting married in that book, and like that king is generally understood to be Solomon, and the marriage in question is generally understood to be the marriage of Solomon and Sheba, right? Who, as I said, are traditionally understood to be lovers, right? So they're lovers, but you know, they can't remain lovers. Like she has a country to rule far, far away, and he has to stay here and rule. So they like trade wisdom and have this beautiful thing. And she is a wise partner who calls him on his shit and like puts him back on the right track, right? She's around for a while, but eventually she leaves. She is generally understood to be pregnant when she leaves. Legendarily, the like royal line of Ethiopia descends from that child in her belly, right? Menelaik is like legendarily understood to found the royal line of Ethiopia, right? So I understand them to have basically initiated each other, right? That Solomon has like the God of Israel, a really powerful like mountain thunder god, right? That is his primary god, and she's got this planetary wisdom, and they teach each other, and out of that grows like what really we would call modern Judaism, right? That being said, historically, like the planetary element in Judaism is actually comes later during the Babylonian captivity, but like shush, right? That's not how stories work. So that's like the basic outlines of the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, one of my very favorite stories.
So Solomon tends to run off the rails when he doesn't have a wise partner there. Is there an unhappy end to his life, his story?
So, okay, so after the Queen of Sheba, like he has, again, I'm going to remind you, she's almost certainly substantially older than him. So as I understand it, he's quite a young man in that story, maybe mid to late 20s, right? And she's like very much full in her queenhood, probably late 30s, maybe 40-ish, right? I mean, she's getting pregnant, so she can't be that old, right? But she's definitely like much more established than he is. He's still quite young. Like he's only like 14 or 15 when he becomes king, right? So, you know, some more stuff happens. He's like on the right track for a while. And then again, like he has no one is wise enough. I think those of us who are smart and clever understand that sometimes we're too clever for our own good. And if there's not somebody smart enough to like follow our fast talk and see through it, we can fast talk ourselves into unwise decisions, right? I see everybody nodding their head. I think most of us listening right now have some familiarity with that problem, right? So that happened like a couple times back and forth, but eventually Solomon at this point in the story, so now we're sort of deviating a little bit from the Book of Kings, which doesn't have much more to say about Solomon, right? Like, so it's not that this is in contradiction to her, but there are all these other sources, right? So part of this story comes from Quran, part of it comes from Torah, a lot of it comes from both Hebrew and pre-Muslim Arabic folklore, and from later Muslim folklore, and from some Christian folklore, like a lot of different sources, right? But the story I'm about to tell is sort of rooted in Talmud, right? So as far as I know, the earliest traces of this story, probably about like maybe 200 BCE, is when we know this story from, but the way it's told, there's sort of this indication that it's kind of a well-known story at that time. So Solomon has this magic ring that helps him control spirits. It helps him speak with spirits. Is he enslaving them? Is he like just making contracts with them? It kind of depends on what version of the story you're listening to, right? But he is definitely their boss. He has made compact with them, right? And in most stories, like until it moves into medieval Christendom, in most of those stories, like that relationship is not necessarily one of slavery. It's like a contract. It's the same kind of peace contract he negotiates with his neighbors. He maybe takes like a jinn princess as a wife as well. Just like he makes peace with Egypt, just like he makes peace with Lebanon, just like he's making peace with everybody else, right? He like makes peace with the jinn as well, right? And this ring is like the token of that, right? And so the jinn help him build the temple, for example, right? But because he's gotten corrupt, the king of the jinn, Ashmedai, his Latin name is Asmodeus, right? Tricks Solomon out of his ring. And then Ashmedai, is a demon. So he like takes over. So he's wearing Solomon's ring and wearing Solomon's face. And Solomon is like exiled into the desert to wander, right? Many people think that like during that wandering, that's when he writes the book Kohelet, which Christians call Ecclesiastes, right? So Solomon lands in the court of modern Jordan, right? Amman. But he still retains all his knowledge. So like he's lost, his magic powers are bound, but he still retains all his magician knowledge, including his really vast knowledge of herbalism. So I think today Solomonic magic has this real reputation for being this really like bookish technical magic. And it is that, but it's also all the other kinds. Like Solomon is famed as an herbalist. So he uses his skills as an herbalist to get a job in the kitchen of the king of Jordan, right? And he's such a great herbalist and like he enchants the food a little bit that he like rapidly becomes head chef and seduces the king's daughter, who is herself also a witch and maybe part jinn, unclear. Her name is Naamah. Is that the same Naamah, the queen of the demons? Normally we would say no, but I mean, when mythological characters have the same name, it's like not for no reason, right? So they get together and now he again has a partner, right? So they run off, they elope together, they make their wedding feast on the beach, they catch a fish, and lo and behold, inside the fish, there is Solomon's magic ring, right? So he puts his magic ring on, they come back to Jerusalem and rule like wisely and well. And because, Israel during the time when Solomon is in exile is kind of how you'd imagine a country would be if it were being ruled by a demon. Cough, cough, Netanyahu. I would not exactly say is a literal demon, but and to be clear, the majority of the population of Israel are not on Team Netanyahu, right? But as always, like when there's a bad king, like it's the people who suffer from there being a bad king, right? And so that's sort of generally understood to be sort of like the final piece of Solomon's story, right? Is that he like gains that wisdom from having wandered like a beggar. And the book of, like I said, Kohelet, the word Kohelet is usually translated as either teacher or preacher, right? But it literally means like someone who can command the attention of the Kohel, of the assembly. It just means like if you get up on a soapbox and talk and people listen, Kohelet. Notably, the word Kohelet is female. There's a lot of male rabbis who like to explain away why that is. Like, oh, he uses the female title in deference to Sophia, like divine wisdom, understood to be female. You can draw your own conclusions about Solomon's obviously genderqueer title, Kohelet. Again, that book is called Ecclesiastes by Christians. I know I don't seem like someone who would have a favorite book of the Bible, but I do, and it's called Let. I really strongly recommend it. In Hebrew more so, but even in English, like the poetry, the magical poetry of that text is undeniable. Like as a magician, when you read it, you're going to be like, oh yeah, the person who wrote this is definitely a magician. And it's just sort of like, it starts off as this sort of like stoic meditation, like, oh, vanity of vanities, everything is pointless, everything that has ever been done under the sun, like, has already been done, there's nothing new. But eventually it comes to this conclusion, like, what does it mean to live a good life? It just means to be happy and joyful, to eat, drink, and make merry, to fuck your wife, to, like, be a good king, to live in peace, that, like, that is the core of what it means to live a life, like, in alignment with the divine is a life in alignment with joy. And it's, like, shocking that that book made it into the Bible, because it's actually, like, not the kind of book that priests and rabbis generally approve of. And in fact, so unlike most books of Torah, linguists tell me, like, I read Hebrew, but not this well, like, not like linguist well. So I am told that almost, and I think this is probably true, almost all books of the Torah are not, like, written by a single person, right? That, like, in a way that the language of it makes clear, right? But that Kohelet almost certainly is the work of a single author. It has a very clear, like, voice behind it, right? Which to me, like, when I commune with Solomon as a spirit, like, that is the closest. Kohelet is the closest to the voice of Solomon that I hear. Except there's this little epilogue at the bottom that even in translation, you're like, whoa, is this somebody else talking? This has to be somebody else. And it is. And the epilogue is like, oh, we didn't mean all that part about being happy and having sex and drinking. You should probably just pray more. But it's like, everybody agrees is a substantially later, like, scribal addition to that text. And I think everyone is in agreement that, like, the only reason that book and the Song of Songs, which has a similar, like, poetic vibe to it, the only way those books made it into Bible is that, like, the magical beauty of their poetry is, like, undeniably divine. Like, particularly in Hebrew, but if you read them in good translations, you can really, like, I think you will find. So I really, really do recommend that book to magicians. Especially when you're feeling like, oh, everything is pointless and nothing is new and everything's stupid. Like, there's a book for that. I recommend it. It's not long.
I definitely, number one, I don't have much to add in a cultural aspect, because one, Zara, you have the benefit and the advantage of, and the privilege, I mean, of being part of a culture, understanding the language, actually go to the actual content, the actual root of it. I'm glad, though, that the education that I received in my Christian theology, a small Christian theology background that I have, it does definitely fit with the story, because at the end of the day, I think a history that it was given. I won't add more on that historical aspect, but I can definitely add, as a person that is from South America, that is receiving a whole bunch of religion that is not from that continent, from that space, in the Catholic and then posteriori Reformed Christianity education that I did receive, Solomon is seen as that person. She's that girl. She's wise. She's smart. She has the beauty. She has the money. Solomon is that character that is super, super. And the way that I perceive him, I actually had the opportunity to watch a movie called 3,000 Years of Longing quite recently. And it portrays a Solomon that I saw the movie actually while I was reading your book, Sarah. Mm-hmm. And the Solomon...
I saw the movie while I was writing this book, I believe.
Well, the Solomon that is presented in that film, I was like, damn, he's hot.
Same.
Damn, he's smart.
I really felt like that movie really, like, the Solomon in that movie. I mean, I don't mean, like, historically, but I'm just saying, like, it captured the, like, vibe that I feel of Solomon. From Solomon. Absolutely.
And in Christianity, in my experience in the church that it was, something that my pastor used to say was, like, let's not necessarily call the spirit of Solomon, but let's ask for God Solomon's wisdom. And the history of Solomon was constantly mentioned in our space more than a cautionary tale. It's more like we strive to be like him. But as you mentioned, Ecclesiastes, as we call it in Spanish, it's that book that definitely you read when you need to revamp your mentality or your attitude towards life. Because even in Christianity, I mean, we can notice it, the religiosity and the fanatism and all of that. There were points that you had to sit down with the pastor and, okay, what is life about? And pretty much he was like, life is about eating good, be happy, and praising God. Exactly. That's pretty much it. Which, again, I'm just talking about my experience on how we see Solomon in Venezuela and my experience in Christianity with them.
Yeah, so let me say something. I think when I talk about Christianity, like, I should really be clear. What I am really talking about is the particular kind of like white supremacist, evangelical, crazy Christianity that we have in the United States.
No.
And I appreciate that that's not like all of Christianity.
Absolutely. And believe me, every single time that I hear it. Just like the
wackadoodle black hat Jews bent on genocide are not all of Judaism. Like, I understand everybody's got their issues. That's the kind of Christian I encounter where I live.
And I get it. And I get them. I'm in Florida. So that's exactly what we see here. But thank God for witchcraft and for living religion.
Amen.
That, like, I constantly say theology was literally the door that opened the road of history and religion. But anywho, I do see Solomon as that character. And finally, when I was Catholic, because I studied in a Catholic high school, we received actually a story of Solomon when he was younger. And he had all his siblings, and they were competing like for the throne and all of that. And one of the funny things that were mentioned, even in that Catholic church, is that Solomon was very wise at his young. I know that he was already king around that age that you mentioned, but even when he was even younger, he was already blessed with a lot of wisdom and knowledge and skills. Right. So, I was listening to all the things that you say, and I cannot add anything new. I just can say what has been my experience in the historical cultural element when it comes to talk about how that translated to South America. And agree to it.
And then I'm going to say one more thing, which I'm going to expand on something you said, AB. So you were talking about like early in like very shortly after he's king, there's this story that I didn't tell where he goes up to the high place at Gibeon, right? And he like, he incubates a dream, right? So he like performs a ritual in order to attain spirit contact in his dream, a very common theme in Torah, right? At the high place of Gibeon. And like God appears to him and asks like, what do you want? Do you want riches? Do you want women? And Solomon's like, just give me wisdom. And God's like, good choice. I'm going to give you wisdom and riches and ladies and and power and everything because you asked for wisdom. And I think to me, like that little story,
confetti comes down.
Like, you're gonna get all the honeys. Yeah, really. That really is how that story goes in Torah. And I think like that really, I think is at the essence of Solomon, right? That when you seek after wisdom, like wisdom is the key that opens riches and power and knowledge and magic and romance, although I will say in my life, wisdom has not led so much to romance. But, like all the things, right? And so I think that story is also, that's the story I think of as really central to Solomon that I didn't tell. So I thank you for
the book that is attributed to him singularly, Kohelet, that is Ecclesiastics in the English? Yeah. Okay. And then I feel like I knew this, but
there are several books attributed to him. So like the book of Proverbs is also
right, of course,
attributed to him, and some of the Psalms.
Right. And then
and also the songs, the
Song of Songs,
right? Yes, of course.
Yeah.
But remind me, I feel like I knew this, but what does the word ecclesiastic mean? Because people use it as like an adjective as well.
In Latin, it means like sort of the same as Kohelet, like teacher or preacher. It means sort of the same thing, like a person who commands the attention of the ecclesiastos, right? The assembly.
Okay.
It means a charismatic person, but in English, I think we would normally translate it as priest, or not really priest, like someone. So in Catholicism, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in Catholicism, but also in ancient Judaism, priest is like a specific role where you have like specific ritual duties, right? Ecclesiastes doesn't exactly mean that. It means more like preacher. Or in Judaism, we would normally translate as teacher. Okay. Like rabbi also just straight means teacher.
Okay.
right? But I think Ecclesiastes is in that, is a Greek translation, but made male.
And then, of course, there's a number of texts attributed to him that are not in the Bible, which then kind of another topic. But yes, we have a lot of other texts. I'm really fascinated at this idea of almost a secret priestesshood as the queendom of Sheba, and the way you talk about that, and like the mysteries of the thunder god and the star mysteries, and then not only the initiating of each other, but the tying together of the royal lines. I mean, for me, this is a compliment. I'm having all of these references in my head to Mists of Avalon and the secret priestesses of Avalon.
And the Bene Gesserit. I do.
Yeah, the Bene Gesserit, of course.
Yeah, I mean, like, I have a fondness for that particular kind of witch, nun, spy, sorceress story. Like, that's my jam. I'm into those stories. But yes, I think of it that way, except to understand that, like, it's not a secret in Sheba. That is actual queen.
But now it is, because it's almost like there's been a cover up, right? Like then that would have been maybe even the more respected, maybe if she was the established older.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. There is definitely the implication that, with the possible exception of Egypt, Sheba is the most powerful, like, regional political player and richest. Other than, again, maybe Egypt. I will say personally, I understand Sheba to just mean broadly sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, there are a lot of people have a lot of opinions about where Sheba is.
Right.
I don't think it is intended in the context and in the, like, historical and textual context. I don't think it is in, like, the people who were hearing that story when it was new, I think they understood Sheba to just be like Shangri-La, like, like a mythic, like Wakanda.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ancient Wakanda. That's how I think.
It was something that was poignant to me was that the Queen of Sheba was testing Solomon's wisdom. I mean, that's the point of the story. The queen is testing his wisdom. I mean, already we have the idea that maybe the female is possibly more wise than the king until she's tested him, right? Which to me seems like an unexpected turn of what I would expect in the roles that I would expect in the story. Other than it does pull in this idea of wisdom is feminine, Sophia, like you mentioned. I really liked this idea of that she was the goalpost in a sense, like the test of wisdom in this.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, that part is not me. Like, that's just what the book
right. I mean, it was in our stories from the Bible, like videos that I was going to say, like, that's watching.
Just the story. Yeah.
But
exactly.
I mean, that's why that's especially even why it jumped out at me is like, say he had failed the test, and it's like, nope, because the Queen of Sheba is really wise, and she was able to trick him. But then, do you think there is an overlap of this idea of that, like, wisdom itself is feminine, in linguistically feminine?
I mean, Solomon describes wisdom as his lover in a very, like, erotic way on multiple occasions, both in the Song of Songs, but also throughout Proverbs, right? Like, I understand that I probably should be able to, like, just perfectly cite chapter and verse, and I cannot. But there's definitely a part in Proverbs where Solomon is like, wisdom was the great love of my youth, and I lusted after her as I have after no other, right? And sought to make her my queen, or something like that. It's, I would say, like, midway through Proverbs. Again, I can look up, and it's in the book.
Sure.
I mean, like, I can look up an exact citation. But truthfully, that's probably close enough that Google will find it.
Well, and that actually reminds me, like, experiences I had in the past, looking at the Psalms and reminding myself, like, okay, but if you were to read, like, we're reading where they say wisdom, but say I'm reading it to myself in English and substitute Sophia, wisdom, then suddenly now it's personified, and it's like a feminine aspect of God figure, and it really changes the reading of the psalm.
So I think I do that when I read all kinds of mythology in both directions. Like, it goes the other way too, right? That when we're reading stories about Zeus and Hera, and we suddenly start translating those names, and those names are about sky and air, right? Like they take on a new quality. And I think it's important to understand that in all that it goes that way, that Solomon, you can do that with the human names too. That instead of calling him Solomon, you can call him the peacemaker. And instead of calling him David, you can call him the beloved, right? Like all of the names mythologically, the spirit names in English are often translated to seem like not people, right? But it goes both directions, that the names in Torah, like they all mean things, right? And that like when you translate those names, it really adds a new dimension to the text.
It's a quality that we can also see reflected in the Bible, and I imagine that also in the Jewish culture. Typically, the names do not only showcase a quality of a person, they showcase the element itself. Pretty much the name is what they are, more than what they do.
Certainly that is the case for like non-human spirits. Okay. It is slightly less the case for humans because almost all humans in the Bible have more than one name. Certainly. Right? So like Solomon's magic name that is given to him by Nathan the prophet is Jedediah. Yedidah, the beloved of Jah, of the god Jah, right? And like a lot of, so like Ima Sarah, right? Like her name before she founds Judaism, like before she becomes a mother, and she's like 98 when she becomes a mother, right? Her name is Sarai, right? But her name before that, which means, it's normally translated as priestess, but it's really like, that's a really like medieval European retrojection onto what really means more like chieftainess, okay, right? Or like tribal leader. Like princess is just not like, it doesn't really capture how Bronze Age politics work in that story, certainly, right? But her given name as a child is Yiska, which means seer, because her eyes are like everybody who looks at her can see the like spark of the like spirit world in her eyes. Yiska, the seer, right? And everybody like in Torah, their names, like when you just translate their names, I think it really gives you a new profound understanding of the stories. And I think that's true for all mythology. Like that is equally true in Greek mythology, right? So like in Orphic Hymns Grimoire, when I'm translating Greek myths, sometimes I just translate the names, right? And I think you get it really like awakens the stories in a more profound way where you're not like stuck in the like soap opera elements of Greek mythology. And it really like transforms them into like a war between thunder and heaven. You know what I mean? Yeah. Is like a different kind of a story, yes, in English. Yes. So yeah, but yeah, as we move, I'm going to transition into talking about more Solomonic magic, right? Which you brought up, Aaron, and we've sort of been dancing around, right? So we start off with this biblical figure of Solomon, but like that mythology continues to grow. So Solomon as a magician really comes into his own in late antiquity. So when we talk about late antiquity from a Jewish standpoint, we really mean between the rise of Christianity, like post-Christianity, but before the rise of Islam, right? That's really sort of the time period we're talking about. And in that time period, like already before Christianity arises, right? Solomon already has this reputation as a magician, but it really solidifies in the first couple centuries CE, right? And so we have more texts legendarily attributed to Solomon, including like the Testament of Solomon, which I would say is in some ways like the earliest work that I would really call Solomonic magic. And it's like got a little frame story about like Solomon's building the temple and some of his workers are getting sick and yada yada. But really there's just this light frame story around the essence of the book, which is a spirit catalog. Here's a spirit, here's its name, here's its powers, here's the angels that like subdue this demon, etc., right? And a key component of Solomonic magic is that it is essentially like name magic, right? So Solomon himself is doing all different kinds of magic. And I'm not a big fan of categorizing magic, but one way to do it, the way Agrippa does it, is you have these three categories, right? Which roughly correspond to like the three worlds. Right? So we have natural magic, right? Which is like embodied magic that takes its power from material things, plants and stones, but also like energy work in a human body, like magic that is rooted in matter. And then we have another category, which Agrippa calls celestial, but we would call astrological, which is really rooted in time, right? And so in Judaism, we really have this sanctification of time, that like our temples are not built in space, they're built in time, right? So like that Shabbat is a cathedral we visit once a week as we move through time, right? And that like our Holy of Holies Abraham Heschel has this quote that I probably won't get right that says, like, our Holy of Holies is the one that the Romans nor the Germans couldn't burn. It's the temple we build in time, right? That we build in our hearts, we build in time, right? And that's a consistent theme in Judaism. We have this temporal magic, astrological magic, right? The magic of the Queen of Sheba. And then we have this third category, which there's matter-based and time-based. And then we have this third category, which Agrippa calls divine, and I might call like abstract or ideal, not ideal like perfect, but ideal like ideas, right? And that's in the context of Hebrew magic generally, and Muslim magic as well, and generally a lot of magic, right? That's magic where the essence is really relying on like names and formulas and sacred geometry and just generally things that are bound in neither space nor time. And so when we talk about Solomonic magic, like in the modern day, we're almost always talking about that third kind, right? And that really starts in late antiquity with the Testament of Solomon, and it grows out. So we have all these roots coming from different cultures. We have like Egyptian priestcraft and like these complex Jewish roots. And we've got this Greek goetic element. Goetia in this context means like spirit magic, right? Like Babylonian astrological magic, and they're sort of coming together to form like this tree trunk through late antiquity that is then going to spread back out, right? And so a lot of people, when they talk about Solomonic, are only thinking about like this one branch of Western European, late medieval, early Renaissance Christian magic, but there's also a lot of Byzantine magic, which is different. There's Muslim Solomonic magic, there's Jewish Solomonic magic, there's Arabian pagan magic, there's Solomonic magic is today, I understand, quite popular in like African diaspora religions, right? And in African tribal religion, again, the royal line of Ethiopia is Solomonic. Like there's all these complicated parts of Solomonic magic that today, again, right? Like those leaves and branches are all like intertwining again and forming this like new cool thing, like in our times, right? And all of that, the Solomonic magic, the defining characteristic of Solomonic magic is that you learn it from Solomon.
And so we need to pursue that further, but I want to pause and say you're blowing my mind when you talk about the concept of that the temple is time and the magic is like the astral magic is time.
So I really strongly recommend a book. So it's a book of Jewish theology, but like I recommend it to all magicians. It's called The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man, and it's by Abraham Joshua Heschel, Heshel. But if you Google search, or I'll send you guys a link that we can send to people,
Sure.
The particular essay I am referencing is called like The Sabbath as a Temple in Time, and you can find it all over the internet. Like he's a very prominent late 20th century Jewish, perhaps the most important, I would say, 20th century Jewish theologian. But it's a great book about like the nature of sanctification of time from a Jewish standpoint, but like you don't have to be Jewish to derive value from it, I don't think.
Sure. And Nick Farrell, who was like ahead of in Order of the Golden Dawn and now has his own tradition because he, I think, expanded outside the bounds of the Golden Dawn. He had a blog post basically where he was talking about people attributing the elements and the directions to the basic lesser banishing or invoking ritual of the pentagram from the Golden Dawn, but how he was interpreting it as time actually. And I don't know how orthodox or correct necessarily his translations of the names that are spoken in the four directions, because they're Hebrew names, in the four directions of the ritual of the pentagram were, but he was relating to like how in his mind they were pertaining to like the past and future and the present and manifestation. And so I'm very excited to explore this further.
I mean, I'm familiar with that idea. I think it's an interesting idea. I will say that, the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram is very, very closely, like almost word for word, modeled on a traditional Jewish bedtime prayer that is often sung to children. And I mean, I can translate the names very quickly, right? Like Michael means the one who is like El, right? Raphael means, we usually would translate as the healing of El, but you can also, all of them, instead of translating them as like healer of God, you can also translate them as God of healing. Like it does actually mean both of those things, right? Gibor is usually translated as might, but like in its root, it really means manliness. Like Geber means man, like
Mhm.
person who is male, manliness, right? But we normally translate it as might. And then who did I forget? Oriel means the light of El. I mean, like they quite straightforwardly, that's what those names mean. But that doesn't mean they're like not other things as well.
Like for the ritual, then there's the activating vibration of like YHVH, Eheya, Adonai, and so and then how those might interplay with it as well.
Yeah, so the most holy name, right? Yud He Vav He. In Judaism, we don't pronounce that name. Like it's really considered like deeply, deeply inappropriate and appropriative for people to say that name out loud. So I appreciate that you didn't. Sometimes Christians will say it out loud as something like Yahweh or Jehovah, but again, I would never use names like that. And I feel like it's sus when other people do, but you know, people should like, there are like actual literal Nazis and genocides happening in the world, so I'm maybe like not going to get worked up about how people say names. You know what I mean? Like we have real problems. So that name is generally understood to be like, okay, here's the deal. Verb tenses in Hebrew aren't exactly the same as they are in English, but that word is somehow like related to just the to be, like is or was. It's in that kind of vibe. So Eye is also, it's the same root word, right? So the full name is usually Eye, Asher Eye. That name is really hard to translate. So it's often translated as like, I am that I am. So in the story where like Moses finds the burning bush, interesting aside, because we're telling stories on this podcast, right? Which is my favorite. There's this midrash, this Jewish folk tale about that story that says that that bush had been on fire for years, but Moses like always had his head up in the clouds or like in a book, not paying attention to the world around him. So he just walked past it over and over. I enjoy that story.
On my phone.
Yeah, like I really like that story. But so he finds the burning bush, and the burning bush like tells him to like go tell the people of Israel some stuff. Yisrael, by the way, means people who wrestle with El. That's what that word means. And Moses says, who should I say sent me? And the bush says, Eye, Asher Eye. Right? Which is such a complicated answer. Maybe it's like a who's on first situation, right? The bush is like, I am. Like, that's my name. But it's actually not in the present tense. Remember what I said about verb tense? It's more like being in the future tense. Right? So you could translate it like, I am the only thing that is. You could be like, I just am whatever I am. I could be like, fuck you, you don't get to hear my name. My preferred translation is like, I am being becoming. Right? I am being becoming, unfolding in time. But that's a pretty poetic translation. So that's one of the names. Let me think, what else is there? Adonai means Lord. It actually means our lords. Like it's actually plural. And it's like a social role that thankfully we don't really have that means like somewhere between like slave master and like feudal warlord. Like we just don't, you know, our society is structured differently. So just like I was saying about like, it doesn't mean priestess or it doesn't mean princess, it means chieftain. Like, you know, it's a political role that doesn't really exist, but it's in that category. And then what's the last name?
EH, like
so that's AA, right? So that's the first part of AA, Asher AA. And then I think Elohim is the fourth one, right? Which just means so El is the generic Hebrew word for God, like our God, but also anybody else's God, like just God, like little g God. Elohim Elohim is plural, and it's like a complicated gender queer plural. It's like a male, it's a female plural of a male word. It's the gender of that word grammatically is unusual, but it is unquestionably plural. And so like that's the name in Genesis 1, right? Rabbis will like tie themselves into knots trying to explain how that plural word is singular, but explanations generally take one of two categories. One that I feel like is just obvious rabbinic nonsense, which is like, oh no, we use the plural because it's like honorific plural, like we do for we, for the queen. But that's bullshit. Like that's not actually how biblical Hebrew works. Like that's, and also Adonai is also, there's a lot of plural names that, and also like it doesn't take plural verb. Like it's a weird, that to me, that explanation doesn't really hold water. And the other camp is like, oh no, it's plural. Like it means like the whole like circle of all the gods. And that I find perhaps a more compelling.
And then because you are also in love with the full Mediterranean.
Yeah, I just love magic is actually the thing.
Right.
Like like, I love those kinds because I know them best, but I've never hit a kind of magic I didn't love. Like, the little bits of like South American magic I know, they seem amazing. The little bits of like Western European, like heathen magic I know, that seems great. Like, I love all of it. Chinese, I have a lot of, my intro class is translated into Chinese, so I have a lot of Chinese speaking students, and they teach me Chinese magic, and it's amazing.
Mentioning about like verb tense and like I am, but it's also like to be, or have you seen the translations of the Egyptian morning sun salutation to Kefera, the scarab god? And it's like, it's something like Kef, Kefera, Kef. It's like, I am being by becoming, to be, become, because the name of Kefera like means become, to become.
Yeah. I think a lot of gods in their indigenous language have names that are closely related to the word being.
And the sounds of breath. Right? Like we have a lot of these sacred, you know, like the first god's name is just like,
The letter Aleph in Hebrew, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, it's the letter that the English A, you know, all modern alphabets descend from Paleo-Hebrew, like actually. And so Aleph, like we translate it with the letter A, but Aleph doesn't make a sound. It's the sound of like you open your mouth and take a breath to prepare to say something. So the way I was taught is that you say uh-oh, and the sound in between the syllables, that's the sound of the Aleph. Wow. The sound of sacred breath, the sound of silence is the Aleph, the sacred Aleph, with which creation begins.
So
sort of. There's a complicated story. Creation actually starts with B.
Oh.
Bereshit in the beginning. To begin with.
Okay, so we it starts with B because it's the beginning. No, I don't know.
Well, you know,
I'm kidding.
It is. Like Torah the first word in Torah, like Torah normally, right? You normally translate it like Bereshit ba'ara. In the beginning, God created. But like it would also, I think it's better to translate it as to begin with. Ooh. God created. But there's also this Talmud story that is like a story you teach kids when you're teaching the alphabet. And you start at the end of the alphabet and you work your way through, where like all the letters are like presenting themselves to God and like, start with me. And Aleph is like really egotistical. And God is like, I don't know about all that. I'm going to make you the first letter. But B, Beth, which means house, you were like modest and homely. And so I'm going to start Torah with you. Bereshit starts with B. And the character looks like a little, less clearly in modern Hebrew, but it looks like a little house. Uh-huh. It means house.
How, so I imagine you grew up with the stories of Solomon, yes? Or not so much?
Ish. Like, I mean, the same way most people in our culture, I usually say that I grew up atheist, but I don't practice anymore. Okay. I grew up mostly secular. Like, I grew up Jewish, but not religious.
Okay.
So I grew up with Torah stories only in the way, like, everybody in our culture grew up. Like, they're actually unavoidable.
When do you think the story began to interest you and speak to you in your, you know, and to, like, an inspiration of practice?
You know, when I got into Solomonic magic, right? You know, I was always into magic. Like, always. In the way that, like, all 3-year-olds are into magic, but most of them grow out of it. I just never grew, like, that didn't take. Like, I was tried to have it beat out of me by our culture, like everybody. Not my parents. My parents thought it was silly and, like, little kid stuff, but they didn't think it was bad. They just thought it was dumb. Like, baby stuff. So I always knew it was real, right? And, like, I got excited. When I was about 14 or 15, I encountered a book called Ritual Magic by E.M. Butler, which was like my first exposure to Solomonic magic. And by that point, you know, I'd been trying. It was very clear to me that like the kind of like pop Wicca magic I was encountering in the 90s, like that like there were little tiny pieces of like real magic in it that you could like feel when you touched them. And you could like feel the magic in certain kind of like folk tales or mythology. But that was the first book where that was the book that introduced me to grimoires. And I was like, oh, this is the magic I've been looking for. Now, of course, with exposure, I got a little jaded on that too. And, you know, there's a lot of fake nonsense in there too. And like Christian blah, blah, blah and whatever. But like that was my introduction to Solomonic magic, was a history of grimoire magic by Eliza Marion Butler.
And so then in the story, it talked about Solomon's ring and how he was able to utilize spiritual help in his work. But I want to get into the book a little bit that you've written, which is The Sorcery of Solomon. But you're focusing on something called the Solomonic Pentacles, which is a little bit different than what we hear about in the narrated version of the story that we went through.
Yeah, so we were talking about the Testament of Solomon. So that leads into this medieval tradition of grimoires. The word grimoire is closely related to grammar. It means textbook, really, like a magical textbook. And so there's these grimoires. You read the little bit of an introduction to them. And a lot of these grimoires have like this frame story about how this magic is handed down from Solomon. Now, as a 14-year-old, when I encountered that, I was like, yeah, that's true. Like, I just bought it. I was like, yeah. Obviously, right? But when you would read the text, it was like obviously Christian. I was like, well, Solomon, I don't know what this is. So I just kind of stripped out all the Christianity. I was like, well, Christian just threw that in there, and I just took it back out and replaced it with Jewish stuff. So what perhaps the most famous of those Solomonic grimoires is called the Key of Solomon. There's actually 2 different books called the Key of Solomon. I am talking about the Greater Key of Solomon. There's also a book called the Lesser Key of Solomon, or the Lemegaton, right? Which itself, each of these books themselves contains multiple books. And each of these books is not really a book as much it is like a family of related texts, right? And in some ways, the Testament of Solomon that I mentioned could be considered like the very earliest version of the Key of Solomon,
yeah,
right? So the Key of Solomon has a lot of different pieces in it, but the magic in the Key of Solomon, I would say, is primarily Greek in origin, right? And style. Right. And it is definitely written by Christian warlords for Christian warlords. That is clearly the intent of that text. But inside that text, there's this another piece that, for a variety of linguistic reasons, including the fact that, there's a book 1 and a book 2, and the pentacles are not in book 1 or book 2. They're in between the 2 books. There's clearly this other book kind of stuffed in the middle, which has these Hebrew pentacles, right? So they're Hebrew wizard amulets for a variety of purposes. And that's really the focus of my book, is those pentacles. And in particular, my book focuses on one particular version of those pentacles by S.L. Mathers, who is one of the founders of the Golden Dawn. His version came out in, you'd think I would know this date, I'm going to say 1888. And his wife, Moina Mathers, is Jewish and has a quite solid Jewish education. If you look at the history of Mathers' writing, you'll notice there's this year where suddenly he knows Hebrew and Judaism, and that's when he married her. So we attribute that book to him, but I think it's pretty clearly a joint endeavor between the 2 of them. Sorry, you asked a 1-word question and then I cut you off and said 8 paragraphs.
No, that's great. Avi, are you dying to get in anything before
listen,
I
I'm
keep
just
going?
Here. I'm enjoying just the conversation. I feel that I'm not in the podcast. I'm listening to the podcast. I'm just here taking notes. I feel I'm not going to say I feel well-rounded, but I do have to say that a lot of this information is in the book. And to take advantage to invite everyone to buy the book, you go over the names. You give an elaborated explanation of the names of God in there. You go through the
I really think everything I've said so far is in the book. Plus a ton more.
Yes, absolutely. You go over the story of Solomon in there. So, of course, I do have to say that you have said some things that are not mentioned in the book, and that's why I'm I'm getting the extended version right here. So, hey.
Well, I will also say there were 50 more pages of this book that got cut to bring it down to the size my publisher
the extended edition next year.
The extra stuff, a lot of it, there's a course I teach. All of the extra stuff's in the course. Some of it's on my website.
Yes.
But originally, I wanted all of this to be in the book, but it needed to be shorter, so we cut a bunch of stuff.
And so you mentioned the pentacles that you're focusing on Mathers' translation of the Key of Solomon. So because of that, I want to say when I heard of the project, I was like, oh, do I need another copy of the Key of Solomon? That's not what this is.
Right.
And so that is not me giving any backhanded thing at all. That is not this at all. And I'm so happy that I said, yeah, I better get it.
I totally understand.
At my doorstep.
Because that's how I feel. So here's what I will say. As soon as I saw these Hebrew amulets, I was like, cha-ching. But let me be clear, my Hebrew at that point, no. I don't mean cha-ching, I'm going to make money. I meant cha-ching, this is amazing magic. I want this. Okay, yeah, yeah, right? as soon as I saw them when I'm like 14, they have words all over them. And I was like, yo, what do these words say? And then I spent the next 30 years asking people that question. Like, hey, bro, you're an expert on Salmonic magic. What do these words say? And a lot of people would be like, I mean, some of them they can translate. Like, some of them are quite straightforward here. But a lot of Hebrew magic, it relies on like codes and all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And so I would ask people, and they'd be like, a lot of people would be like, I don't know. That is a perfectly legitimate answer. And you don't technically need to know what all the words mean to make the pentacles work. But I do think if there's words written on your magic, it's probably important what they mean. And some people, I would ask them what they mean, and they'd be like, oh, it doesn't matter. And I'd be like, I beg to differ. I think if there's words on your magic, it probably does matter what those words say. Absolutely. And I was mad. I read every book on the pentacles I could find, and none of them answered what I thought was the very straightforward question of what the fuck do these words mean? Which it turns out is a hard question to answer. They're quite corrupt. Yeah. Right? And they're in code. And I say corrupt because while I was researching this book, I found a previously unpublished, I found based on Stephen Skinner's work. So Stephen Skinner knew about this text, but I don't think he had ever seen this text. So there's a Hebrew text of these pentacles that is much more complete, right? So I'm just going to show, like, here is an example of, like, right? So here is a Mathers style pentacle. It's got some words around the outside, and then it's got two names on the inside. This is what that pentacle looks like in the Hebrew manuscript. This printout quality isn't very good, but like... Oh. See how it's got like a million more words on it? Yeah, so now I have this Hebrew manuscript of them that I found while I was working on this book, and that's why I say corrupt, right? In the Hebrew, when you can tell, if you look at these manuscripts of the Key of Solomon, you can tell that many of them are being copied by people who don't even know the Hebrew alphabet. Like sometimes they just have a little squiggle that's not even a recognizable letter, right? And so like there's this whisper down the lane process of this book being transcribed by people who can't read it. Right? But in the Hebrew copy, even though the Hebrew copy I'm looking at is relatively late, right? I think it's like a 1790 edition. It's like much more intact than much earlier, like 1500s copies that Mathers is working from in Latin and French and Italian mostly. Because it's being translated, it's being copied by people who are fluent, and it's being copied in a culture where it's not illegal. So Christian grimoires, for good reasons, like I appreciate that cite your sources and naming names are actually the same thing in a culture where magic is illegal. But in the Jewish text, they're like, well, my name is Isaac and my dad's name is this, and I live in the city of Worms, and I copied this from Judah Perez, and he lives in London, and he copied it from this guy, and I've seen other manuscripts, and this one says this, even though this manuscript says that. Like there's just, because it's not illegal, it's like, magic is still weird. Like maybe you don't want your daughter to marry a magician. Like they're still weirdos, but you're not gonna like get burned at the stake. You're just like a weirdo, right? Like like all of us are maybe weirdos, but we're not going to the stake for this the way we would be in medieval Europe, right? So those manuscripts, like not just are those people Hebrew literate and fluent, very Hebrew fluent. Like he makes like really complex linguistic cryptological analysis of these things. The scribe, right? So that's my next book coming out, right? But so my book really, my primary goal is to answer the question, there are words on these, what do they say? Right? And so 2/3 of the book is really a very in-depth analysis of like not just translating the names, but all kinds of like context. Like here's other times those names are used. Here's a bunch of different rabbinic commentaries on those names, et cetera, et cetera. And then the first third of the book is sort of like an on-ramp for people who don't have experience in Solomonic magic to kind of get them to that more technical part of the book. But yeah, I wrote this book because I'm mad that nobody wrote this book before.
Can I say thank you as well for you giving the opportunity to the reader, especially me. And this is something that I'm very emphatic with your book. I don't think that is a book focused for beginners, but it's beginner friendly. I have no idea. I have a very humble, very basic background of this, and still there's a lot of information that I didn't know. And the mere fact that you go over explaining those little those words, and you also give the opportunity to the people that do not belong to the culture to be like, okay, if you deem necessary, you can make this change. And when you make a change of the pentacle, you also explain that as well. Hey, I made this change because. So that was really, really cool.
Yeah, so there are some times where I made, like, some of them, there's just, like, clearly spelling errors. Like, obviously, so if people know even a little bit of Hebrew, you might know that some of the letters look very, very similar. Like, I honestly, that's not the original script for Hebrew. The script we see, like, that rabbi script, is called Asherit or Assyrian. Like, that's a quite late, like, font. Right. And sometimes I imagine it was designed to specifically make it hard for people who aren't hyper educated to read. Because some of these letters are like almost identical. And so when they're getting copied by people who don't read Hebrew, they get changed. So sometimes I'm just being like, this is obviously a spelling error. And here's what I think it should be. And here's why. And if you don't like it, make up your own. Right. But I do try and be super clear about like exactly what I have changed and why I changed it. And usually I'm just correcting spelling errors.
And in addition to sort of like this textual archaeology, there's practical work in there, like exercises outside of the pentacles, but then even with the pentacles, like where to start in drawing the lines, which letters to begin with. It's I try and be mindful. I'm trying to write for beginners while still keeping it like really interesting for people who aren't beginners. So I try and give like hyper detail, like do this, do this, do this, do this, like numbered list instructions. But that's one way to do it. I'm not saying that's like the only way to do it. I'm just saying if you don't know what you're doing, I think of it like a cookbook, right? So like if you don't know how to cook, you should follow the recipe. But, like, I've been cooking for a long time. Like, I started cooking for my family as a kid. Like, I basically never follow a recipe. I just kind of, like, read some recipes and get inspired and then just cook. And I think magic is like that, too. So I'm right. I think of it as, like, a cookbook. I do give explicit instructions. So, like, you don't really need... Look, if this is the very first book on magic you read, I think you better be a nerd. Like, you know what I mean? You're going to need to do some other reading. But, like, you could do it. Like, and if you're a nerd, you'll even like it. But if you want like a softer introduction, maybe start with the intro class and then this one. But I do try and like give this sort of ramp in before I jump into like the harder material. Like, I don't even want to say harder, just like technical and bookish. Nerd stuff. In the text that you found with the more complete Hebrew illustrations of the pentacles, do you are you able to drop any hints about if you found any textual surprises in the magical instructions?
Not surprises for me. I will say that for me, it actually confirms a lot of things that I suspected, right? So, for example, most of my colleagues are of the opinion that the pentacles themselves probably date to like the 1400s in probably Italy. But I have always thought that they're probably a little bit earlier, like 12th century Sepharad. That is to say, the Jewish communities in Muslim-controlled Spain and Portugal. And like this book, in some ways, confirms that. So like, it's hard to say, and like I'm still working with it. So I want to be clear, like nothing, I might be wrong about everything I'm saying. Like I'm still very much in the research phase and like talking with other experts. But like, for example, sometimes it'll, Biblical Hebrew doesn't have names for a lot of European animals. Or like the word for deer really means like anything in the deer family. Could be a gazelle, could be an antelope, like they're all kind of the same word. So sometimes it'll give the Hebrew word and then in parentheses it'll say like in the vernacular and then another word. Now, it's not always clear what language that other word is. It's definitely a Romance language. It's not modern Spanish. It's quite far from being modern Spanish. It might be an old form of Italian, but it might also be a language called Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, which just like Yiddish is basically Hebrew mixed with German, right? Ladino is Hebrew mixed with medieval Spanish and some Arabic as well, right? It was like the day-to-day tongue in Sepharad. So there's some of that. Some things that I find in it are like things that would be surprising about the Key of Solomon. So like normal, the pentacles are very squarely inside a normative Hebrew amulet tradition. Like they're very similar to other kinds of Hebrew amulets. But there are certain things that you would expect to see in a collection of Hebrew amulets that are missing. So for example, there's 44 pentacles. There's like 6 pentacles for warfare and not a single one for like healthy pregnancy and birth. But that is a thing you would expect to see. Like even not just in Hebrew amulets, like those are really well represented in Hebrew amulets, but also generally in collections of magic. That's just a kind of magic you would expect. And there's none. But I'll tell you, the very first pentacle in Sefer HaOtot, the Hebrew one, has a variety of uses, one of which is for when you are on the birthing stool, right? For like when you're giving birth. So it like, in some ways, it like, rather than being surprising, it really like, sort of, it fills in what seem like gaps. Like it's weird that there's 44. It's like an unusual number. There's very few Venus pentacles, and almost all of them are basically like compulsive rape spells. Like, but like, so it kind of fleshes them out. The pentacles have a bigger variety of uses, and there's more code, like just straight up code, which is like, so me and my collaborator, like, I say we, but she like wrote a computer program. So a lot of times in Hebrew magic, you'll like take a Torah verse and take like the first letter of every word and form a name out of that, right? So one that people may know is Agla, which is basically an acronym for Ata Gadol Leolam. I don't know, like you are mighty Lord, right? Okay, so it's really easy when you have the verse to construct the name. But when all you have is the name and you're trying to go backwards, not so easy. So we wrote some computer programs to decrypt. We're not going to be, like the Mathers one, look, I've been working with those pentacles for 30 years, so I feel pretty confident sometimes saying like, a ghost told me blah, 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 which I do like inform, but that is being backed by like 30 years of practice. But these pentacles, like I've only had these pentacles for like a year, so they're... I will neither confirm nor deny that I just exploded a fidget spinner. Like it literally went up in pieces all around me. That's what that was. You know, so some of the angel names in this, I think we're not going to be able to translate, but you know, partway in, it became clear that I was going to need some help with this, right? Like, because I have experience with Hebrew, but I am not 100% Hebrew fluent, and I am definitely not read encoded medieval manuscript. Also, as you saw, like, look, Isaac, that's the scribe's name, his like rabbi handwriting on the pentacles, very good. But his handwriting in the notes sometimes leaves something to be desired. Also, it's like not modern handwriting, it's medieval, like Ashkenaz handwriting, right? And so I signed up with, she doesn't want me to say her name like publicly, but I signed up with an academic, like a young woman academic she was then at Oxford, actually, who is a specialist in like medieval Jewish, actually she's earlier, like she specializes in Babylonian incantation bowls, which I'll come back and tell you about some other time, which are kind of like Jewish magic from late antiquity, but she specializes in like Hebrew magical manuscripts. And so I worked with her, and she did, you know, a lot of the translating and decrypting. And so like at this point, you know, we've got a good... So I kickstarted that project, which mostly paid for her because I had to pay her to do that, you know. The first round of translation for Kickstarter backers will be out in the fall, maybe a little bit earlier. And then, actually, I am allowed to say this now. Hadean Press and I will we're going to put out like a fancy version with the translation and a transcription and brand new full color illustrations by Elizabeth Empyrean and commentary that'll be out, I don't know, mid 2025 probably. We're like, we don't quite know. I mean, I'm still working with it, so like, but it'll be out. You know, it's we're working on it. It's coming along. So that's what I'm working on now. And a lot of that stuff, if you take my Pentacles course, you can kind of hear about that as I go. So I talk about those. And so every once in a while, I reference that text in this book, but this book was mostly done by the time I had that new manuscript. And that manuscript is like, I mean, I know we said this book isn't exactly for beginners, but it's beginner friendly. Sefer HaOtot is not beginner friendly. But, you know, like in some ways, this book, Sorcery of Solomon, is like the prerequisite Like, if you really worked through this book and did all the exercises, you would be ready to do stuff for
ready
how
for
to
that
by the
rabbit
time
hole.
it comes out.
I'm ready. Listen.
It's exciting. It's exciting. Like,
oh my god! I'm so glad I'm so glad you're talking to us from like your teaching office right now, because I feel like we're all in school right now.
I have nothing to say.
Look, I taught math. I taught calculus for a long time before I quit to teach witchcraft. I genuinely love teaching, and I know that sounds like just like some fancy advertising hype, but like I really, really fucking mean it. Like, I understand the teaching of witchcraft and like the teaching of like the work of the spirit to be like something that the world desperately, desperately needs right now. And I'm doing my best, and I encourage everybody else to do what they can as well. Like, I think we live in a time where like healers and teachers and like that's really needed in our world. And I am not a healer. I'm a teacher.
I think you're generally a great person. We've had little connection in social media. Same. But it's always been very pleasant. And I see how you'll make posts like, I really need to do this. Anybody know how to do this? I'm looking for a blah blah. Like, you're always building these connections and willing to network, and I just, there is a friendliness and even like just like a humbleness to it that is very refreshing in the community. And so, yeah, I really like that.
I think our culture, like in the magical world, but also our culture more broadly, like just like Western garbage culture or whatever we call it, like it very much tries to like keep us all separate. We're not like, as an extrovert, I feel like I'm not even allowed to talk, like even as an adorable woman, and like much more so for men, and even more so for men of color. Like, even I, who am an adorable white lady, I'm like barely allowed to talk to strangers in public anymore. And so I just do. Like, when I say like teaching, I am really committed to like putting people in rooms with other people. So like I do a lot of traveling to teach, and I try really hard wherever I go. Like I frequently will say I have more than one student in rural Vermont who didn't know each other, but I introduced them. So I'm really committed to like putting people physically in the same room with each other, because when it all falls down, that's there is no survival skill so important as knowing your neighbors' names. And I think we all know, like, I don't want to doom speak, but I think we all know things are going to get worse before they get better. Like, people should be preparing for that.
We've gone so many directions with this discussion.
Sorry.
Is there something that you really wanted to get to about the story specifically, or about the characters in the story that we didn't have a chance to touch on yet?
Just to highlight again that Israel in particular and the world broadly is at our strongest and at our most powerful and at our most prosperous when we make peace with each other, when we work through diplomacy to like know our neighbors and be in communion with our neighbors, both in a geopolitical sense and in your actual literal next door neighbors sense. Like so many people, even people in apartment buildings, like I have had neighbors who I can hear them argue with their kids through the wall, and I don't know their names. And I really make a point to like meet my neighbors and know, and I really encourage people to like the peacemaking that I'm talking about globally, like it starts on your block. And like, I don't maybe like all my neighbors, but like I'm neighborly. I mean, right, I'm saying these aren't necessarily people I would pick. I don't mean I hate them, but they're not necessarily people I'd pick. There was a petition started to not let a witch move into the neighborhood when I moved in. But like, I grew a garden and made friends with like Grandma Jesus over gardening. So now like, I'm pretty adorable. It's pretty hard to hate me once you know me. Like I'm actually quite genial. And also the woman I refer to as Grandma Jesus, she did, when I went around like shaking people's hands saying hello, she's like, oh, don't shake her hand and look in her eye. That's how she witches you. And like that, she was right. That is what I was doing. Like, she's correct. Like, takes one to know one, Grandma. Like, but But she and I were the only people who gardened and the only people who handed out Halloween candy, so even she got right with me after a while. I'm a good neighbor. You know? But yeah, like she was right. That is what I was doing.
I see Sarah putting her
Like,
domination oils in her hand. Hey, neighbor!
no domination oil, just like friendly
J.K. Rowling, just kidding.
Oil. Bayit Shalom, like peace of the home was the oil I had on my hands. But yeah, she's not wrong. If you look in my eyes and shake my hand, you're probably going to be my friend. That's true.
Les.
That worked. Worked on her too. It just took longer. No, I think I appreciate. Look, I live in a predominantly black neighborhood. I understand why I seemed like a gentrifier when I moved in, but I'm not. Like, I'm committed to this neighborhood. I grow a garden. I give away produce. Like, I'm here for good. Like, I'm not looking to flip this house. But I appreciate. Like, I don't like it when the white hippie kids move down the block either. They're not very good neighbors. Yeah. So, like, I understand why there was some trepidation about me. But I really think, like, nothing makes friends with neighbors like being neighborly,
Yeah.
Like, and gardening, I really do think is like the best way to build roots with your neighbors and your community and the land where you live. Like nothing,
I agree.
Nothing builds communion with the spirit of the land like compost.
I agree. I totally agree.
Yeah. Like I grew up in the city, so this is the first time I've ever had land to garden on, and I love it. But even when I had apartments, it was like little pots on the windowsill and stuff. And I think like I really recommend gardening as a spiritual practice, particularly for those of us who like say that we are like all about the divinity of the land. Like if you don't have dirt under your fingernails, then maybe that's like more metaphoric than it could be. Dirt. I'm into dirt magic.
That's important magic.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to Solomon's role as peacemaker. And of course, most importantly, how we manifest that in our life, our culture. But it also is going to give me, I think, a totally new understanding of the possibilities of Solomonic magic. So Solomon
is an amazing like teacher. Like I really recommend like reaching out to Solomon. Like, I use like a Russian saint icon. You know what I mean? Like really, I'm a big fan of the mighty dead as like magical partners. And Solomon in particular.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about what if people want to jump in on the class that's already going to be rolling by this time, and if you have other dates that you want to let people know about.
Absolutely. So you can join any of my courses at any time. They all cycle, or the intro class and the Solomon course, as soon as we finish them, I'm just going to start them again. You can jump in at any time. Once you're in the course, you just are in the course forever, and it gets better. Like anything else, every time I do it, it gets better. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So now it's got a lot of the Sefer HaOtot stuff in the Pentateuch course. So witchlessons.com will find everything. In terms of live teaching, I mean, I have something next week, but I think that's 3 weeks ago by the time people hear this. May Day weekend, the 1st of May, whatever that weekend is, I'll be in Madison, Ohio at Wellspring, which is the ADF, which stands for some kind of Gaelic something. I think of it as A Druid Fellowship, but it's not. It's like Androphane or like, I apologize to whoever's language I just brutalized. But ADF, I'll be at the National Druid Convention Wellspring that weekend. June 22nd, I will be in Birmingham, England at the Magical Women's Conference. I'm going to teach about Sara Tzvi, a really cool kind of like 1600s Jewish necromancy practice. And then I think I have some book readings in London. My little brother lives in England. That's why I'm in England every year. That's why I book events in England, is because my brother lives there. Yeah. And then in July, I will be in Bologna, Italy, doing a lunar witchcraft retreat with Julia Torolo, but I think that might actually be completely sold out.
I think
if people want to do that again, like it'll probably happen again as it's sold out.
I think I was following maybe one of your last trips to England, and you were like, you know, I don't know what the real specifics were, but you were like, oh my God, y'all, they have a pie and there's meat inside. And, you know, and every day it was like a new discovery. Like, oh my God, y'all.
I love that.
I am a total hobbit. Like, I love where I live, but if I was gonna move, like, I gotta say where my brother lives in southern England, like, which from my point of view is basically like the Shire that hobbits live in.
Oh my goodness.
Like, I love it. Like, I will say the cooking maybe leaves something to be desired in England. But yeah, no, I love it. And the ingredients are really good. Like, the produce and meat is like much higher quality than ours. So it's weird that nobody can cook.
Yeah. And
my
I don't,
sister-in-law
like I
is
said,
actually perfectly fine cooking.
I don't remember what the specifics were, but I remember you'd have like a discovery of the day almost, you know, like, oh my God, y'all, they do this here.
Yo, my sister-in-law, I didn't realize this. This is the first time I'd been to her parents' house. She grew up like basically in the shadow of Stonehenge. Like, you can't quite see it from their backyard, but like, she basically grew up in Narnia. It's amazing. I appreciate, dear British friends, that you do not live in a fantasy novel and it's a real place. And I've been to London, and actually my brother and sister-in-law live in Swindon, which is like a post-industrial place just like Pittsburgh. But the countryside is really... I spent a lot of time in Wales last trip, and Wales is particular. I was inside of a 3,000-year-old tree, a yew tree. It was amazing. If I was going to move, England would be high on my list. But I like where I live, and also... I occasionally fantasize and look at real estate, and I would need like 3 roommates to live in a cardboard box in England. Yeah. So I'm going to stay where I am.
I do that all the time. You like look up other countries.
Real estate porn. Like,
yeah. AB, do you want to let any listeners know anything before we close out for the evening?
Well, nothing major in reality. As of now, I'm having a little bit of extra time off on my end, let's say it like that. So I am taking advantage of having conversation with people that I admire and reading more books. Actually, I have a conversation soon with Laura, and another one with Sara as well. So as of now, it's pretty much just that. I have more content coming from my social media, and pretty much I invite everyone to just like, share, and follow. That's my way of income.
I'm Frater Aaron. Until we meet again, may all your travels be filled with wonder.